All right,
Yeah,
here we
that's
are.
one.
Yes, here we are. Here we are. Okay. We are off the cuff and we are sweltering in the heat of California. Leroy, I don't know what you're doing, man, but we've got like your ear. We've got like your right ear and your eye in there. Okay. Now,
It's
well,
up close and personal with Leroy
yeah.
today.
I just wanted to make sure
Yeah.
everybody got a good look at me.
Oh, we're getting a good look at you. I don't know if we want to. And Jane, you're like going off the screen again. I don't know.
Oh yeah,
This is
okay. Do I
this
need
is
to go
our
this way?
yes,
Is it
that
better
way.
this
Yes,
Okay, good,
there you
yeah.
go. Same with Leroy too, but I don't know. This is like this is such a tragic. This is life. Our show today is life without God is absurdity. And so is the beginning of this show. That was the title. That was the title I had. I knew that it was going to come to this. So no.
This is going to be a fun show. This is one of my
Yeah.
favorite topics.
Well,
Oh,
I
great.
framed it.
So Leroy's
Oh,
gonna do all
gosh.
the talking.
I'm okay with that. That's all right, man. We get my wife likes it when you talk better. Apparently, anyway, so that's all right. But even though I say that too, by the way, just so people know, just to preface this, this idea of life without God is absurd. But life with God is still a bit of a mystery, and I don't think there's a purpose to it. But that doesn't mean that every Christian also doesn't live sometimes in absurdity, because often their theology isn't grounded in something solid of the Scripture. It's experiential or some other things that take it away from the Bible. So just because somebody wears the label Christian or says, "Oh, I believe in God," doesn't mean they live life at this level of absurdity. And even if somebody's a biblically faithful, strong worldview kind of stuff, doesn't mean that there isn't mystery, suffering, confusion. So that's sort of the well, I don't think there's a thing as absurdity for that type of person. I mean, we can define that term a little bit, maybe what you mean by that, what we're seeing by that. But I wouldn't think that if you were a biblically grounded Christian with a solid worldview, I don't think there is such a thing as absurdity. I think there might be paradox.
No, yeah. I must have misheard you. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, no, I think there could be paradox of like, hey, this doesn't make sense. But our inability to reconcile life's challenges doesn't mean there isn't a knowledge that God could figure it out. So that's how I would look at that. But let's take a step back, look at that, and kind of see where we're going. So when we talked about this, I know Jane actually had some exciting things about this. She's got some history with this when she studied at Biola there. And Leroy, you said this is your favorite topic. So, hey, when we decided, hey, we're going to do it this week and hit this topic, life with God is absurd, what sort of came across your mind? Where should we start here and dig into this? Either one of you go ahead and go for it.
Batman.
Batman.
You guys, see? That's why I said this is a great topic.
Okay, I will go with you, Leroy. Now, everybody watching is confused.
Everybody's got to be intrigued for like a split second. They got to be like, what is Leroy talking about? Well, there is a famous play that Christians used to know, written by a guy named Albert Camus, and it was called The Plague. And what the plague simulated was a closed system. A town got struck with a plague, not too much unlike our town, where no one could leave the city and no one could come into the city. And
New York.
Albert Camus does. I'm sorry?
That's New York City. They got
Exactly.
Border Patrol. They got everything.
They got everything. But what Albert Camus does in simulating this closed system is he wants to show you what a world would be like without God. So what he does is he has specific characters in the city that play various roles. And what you see is that once the law or once the authority is taken out of the way, these characters began to act in a way, some of them that were commendable and some were uncommendable. But they began to act in a way that you could kind of see and assess. But then once the plague started to lessen and then the police came in, what you started to see is those characters revert back to how they would act if there was authority. That's Albert Camus' plague. Now Batman, remember Batman with Bane? Remember how Bane traps the police under the city? No one could come into the city and no one could leave the city. The writer Christopher Nolan, a noted Christian, is simulating the same thing. He's saying, he's having you look at a closed system and how anarchy erupts in a closed system if there's no God. But then when Batman comes in, who plays the somewhat like God figure, then what do you see? You begin to see order begin to arise. So for me, that was like a great illustration of this idea of what the world would be like without God. And both of those that play and that movie. So that's a very interesting topic.
Yeah. Well, two observations. One, half of that talk, half your face was missing because you're way too close and you're going to the wrong side of the camera. So we all want to see your lovely face.
Let me fix this.
Yeah, do that. No, now you're crooked. I don't know what you are. There we go. That's better. Now I can see you, actually. That's awesome. Yeah, you know what? I don't know if that's intentional, but man, the story with Camus, the Camus that you're bringing up too, boy, doesn't that have a lot of...
Camus.
But no, I mean like intentional in terms of it relates to... I don't want to get down the COVID trail. I want to stay fixated on the absurdity thing. No. But man, I do think that helps us make sense of some of the, people feeling the sense of isolation, and then,
sure.
In terms of some of these cities we see, because everybody's on lockdown and they're isolated, they're sort of left to their own devices. And we kind of see that in a little microcosm playing out.
What Camus wanted to show is he wanted to show people reverting to their true beliefs. So in that play, one set of characters are doctors who are working feverishly to cure people from the plague. One is a criminal who's been hiding, but once the police leave, he's able to come out of hiding and live a normal life. Another one is a blasphemous preacher who just preaches hellfire and damnation. And another one is just a really bad guy. And what Camus is arguing is, if there's no God, if there's nothing outside of these people, then their actions are, there's no need to justify their actions, and there's no real penalty or reward for their actions, because there's no authority, no one outside of them or above them who could make sense of their actions, their lived experiences and the decisions that they made.
Interesting. Jane, what comes to mind for you whenever we talk about that in this topic?
Just being around students, usually you have students who don't believe in God would come to the point that there's no meaning or purpose in life, and you just kind of make it up as you go, and then you just die, and that's it. So those are the kinds of things we talk about. It's really interesting because while you're having these conversations with these students, they actually tend to talk about meaning and live their life like there's meaning. And so, I asked them, what was the purpose of this conversation if in the end it doesn't really matter? And a lot of them say, well, I'm an optimistic nihilist. And I'm like, in my mind, it's like you kind of just gave it more meaning. So it's interesting because, relativism and just being your subjective feelings, you get to pick and choose what you want. And so having these conversations with them and kind of leading them to the logical conclusion of what they think they believe, in the end, they kind of think, maybe I don't believe that. So, just let them process it a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And how, and I think there's so many directions to go with this. When I think of this topic, life without God is absurd. I think most people hear that and think it's some sort of Christian judgmentalism or condemnation or somehow being just mean-spirited or something. But I think what people have to realize is I've spent 23, 24 years, whatever total, in some form of pastoral ministry, with everywhere from young adults to adults in regular churches that I planted, and so I've talked to hundreds of people in their homes and in these private conversations and just all these sort of things, and I'm not saying, so when I say that, this is not based on an academic research study program or how do I craft an argument to win some debate. I think people have to realize that those of us who spend our lives with other people, ministering to other people, helping other people, seeing people suffer, seeing people go through trials, it's a statement of what those observations are. Primarily, it's a statement of my experience with people in life. And so, yes, I can tie that to theology and philosophy, and I can come up with some ideas to back up my observation that it's not just, purely, my own experience. But I think people have to realize that, like I said, watching people struggle and the often the depression that ensues when life gets difficult. When life is easy, it all sort of comes together, makes sense, and we don't have to have this deep sense of meaning. But at times like this, where we are in the COVID lockdowns and the world is the way it is, it does strip away the things that sort of shielded us from the world around us, and we're forced to face often this sense of absurdity, meaninglessness, and lostness in life. So I know that's kind of what came to mind for me when I processed this. So for you guys, oh, by the way, my wife decided the best time. I see she just popped on. She's watching here. Life. She said life without Christ is absurd. But I have to make sure. So she's like cleaning the bathroom, like right over there. You guys can't see. So she's like, and I think she's listening live. So if you hear her, just signal me something, and I'll tell her to turn it off. She's like, I don't. It's one of these live at home show experiences. It's real life gets in. So anyway. But okay, so for you guys. So when we deal with this sense of absurdity, how do we help people discover that? I know, Jane, you mentioned the conversations you've had. I know I've had a lot, but it's not always something that's obvious to people. I guess that's part of the challenge with that assertion. So for the non-believers, let's start with the non-believers, and then we can work our way down to believers who also kind of have this sense of absurdity, and even Christians who struggle with the sense of mystery and suffering and loneliness and loss and all the other things that we may be confused with absurdity, and maybe we can share how those are different. So let's start with the non-believer, though. How do we help people discover this sense of they need God? What are some things you guys have seen that work?
I think the first thing is to make a distinction between temporal and ultimate. Temporal meaning is, and I think Jane was talking about this a little bit, students can get tricked by this sense that in the moment, they find meaning in things, right? Whatever thing they pour into idea or feeling or emotion, they pour into something in the moment is meaningful in the moment. So if we were to try to discuss this with people and not make the distinction between temporal and ultimate, what we would end up doing is we create an obstacle, right? That we couldn't overcome, because on the one hand, they would be arguing for the conversation that I had with my mom, or watching, spending time with a friend, they would say that, that's meaningful, right? But so we would have to agree that in some sense there is temporal meaning, but ultimately, in other words, in a billion and 1 years, does it really matter? If we healed, every single person of cancer, but in a billion and 1 years, everyone died, and the universe has lost all of its heat, and it's grown cold, and there's no life, would it matter? Would it matter if you healed all those people of cancer? Temporarily, sure, but ultimately, absolutely not, because there's no one here to remember. There's no one to think about it. There's no Hall of Fame for people to gaze at the works that you've done. It's all done. It's over. It's finished. There's nothing, which tells us something about, meaning in life. There needs to be in order for there to be real meaning, there needs to be someone to remember it, to cherish it, to give value to it. And if that ends when we die, then really it had some temporal meaning, but ultimately it was meaningless. So I want to bridge the gap between temporal and ultimate.
Jane, what do you say? How do you break in those conversations, and what are the keys you found for that?
I just try to get them to think more of like objectives, because most students are relativists. So to come to terms that there has to be some kind of truth to even have meaning, you have to start with some kind of truth. And so most of the time you're working on, does truth, is it even real? And you could see people making contradictory statements left and right, and you're just like, well, if there isn't truth to what you just said, we can't really even say that's true. And so, like, kids get really hung up on the truth part, and they kind of just like, well, you just give it your own meaning. So I think half the battle is trying to figure out, is truth matter? Because if there is no truth, then obviously there isn't any meaning to anything that we're talking about. So that's kind of where we go. And it's just a long process too. And you build relationships with these students, and, they tell you stories of like hardships and stuff like that. So, and that's where you could really start talking about meaning. It's like, well, if this is so painful, like, shouldn't there be some kind of meaning to all of this? And shouldn't there be some kind of hope to all this? And so, yeah, I just kind of just go through it conversationally and relationally, and just see where those things go, and, bring God into it, because ultimately you can't have any comfort or peace without Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's ultimately, I think people have to realize this too, is that, what you said there at the end is really critical, that this isn't, this discussion we're having about life with God, without God, is absurd. We're not having this because, in an apologetic sense, people think, we were talking about this before the show, Jane, people get this misunderstanding of what apologetics is, that it's this academic debate, or it's winning arguments, or, but, apologetics is being, present with people and helping them discover this sense of purpose and meaning that you're talking about. And I've known too many people who struggled with addiction, or just loneliness and isolation and suicide. And so when we're saying this, it's like, hey, the goal here is we're trying to help people discover something that will not just give them the temporal sort of, oh, I'm happy today. Drugs could do that. We're saying we want them to have, because we know there's an eternity, because we know there is this transcendent reality and truth, we want them to connect by that, because they'll have a deep, abiding fulfillment that they can't get anywhere else, right? I mean, so that's the reason for these kind of conversations. I think that are so critical. It's interesting. One of the things that years ago, you guys remember when Hawking died, right? And it's one of those things, you can't write these things too soon. But I know his daughter Lucy. It was interesting. They did this memorial to him, and it's so funny because here's a guy who believed that we're all just random, no purpose, to our being. It's just sort of this processes of natural things, and we live and we die and it's over. And they made this memorial to him, and his daughter said, this is a beautiful and symbolic gesture that creates a link between our father's presence on this planet, his wish to go into space, and his explorations of the universe of the mind. And so they had this whole thing where they, tried to have this, they tried to create this sense of what can we do, to create this lasting, enduring memorial that that he would last beyond this life. Like you were talking about, Leroy, I wanted to have a sense of legacy. And
we should ask why. He's just a part of the I mean, I'm not saying this myself because I believe this.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying, on his view, he's just a part of the universe's furniture. Sometimes it's here for a minute and it's gone the next. But the interesting part is that even in people who express such ideas, there is a strong desire for their life to be meaningful. Even in death, the people who remember them want their lives to be meaningful, symbolic. Symbolic of what?
Yeah.
And why?
Yeah. I got to read this to you. So I made this post a few years back, and I will read part of it because I thought of it when Jane was talking. And the title of this was An Atheist Longing for a Non-Material World. And I think that's the sort of thing they're longing for. But here was an honest eulogy, as opposed to, I think, the eulogy that was kind of given towards Hawking, I think, was sort of like, he lived life one way, but we can't bear the thought of it ending that way, so we have to pretend that there's a reality out there past the material. But this one I liked. This was actually in a newspaper, believe this or not. Here's the thing. It says, Leslie Ray Popeye Sharping was born in Galveston, Texas on November 20th, 1942, and passed away January 30th, 2017, which was 9 years longer than expected and much longer than she deserved.
True, I read that.
And then she goes, I'll just read a couple more sentences. She said, Leslie was surprisingly intelligent. However, she lacked ambition and motivation to do anything more than being reckless, wasteful, squandering the family savings, and fraternizing about get-rich-quick schemes. And then the last paragraph says, Leslie's remains will be cremated and kept in the barn until Ray, the family donkey's wood shavings, run out. Leslie's passing proves that evil does in fact die and hopefully makes a time of healing and safety for all. Oh my gosh, I love the honesty of that eulogy. You remember reading that, Leroy, back in the day?
There's another one as well that is similar, where someone just totally read a person off after they died in an obituary. They're both crazy.
Yeah.
But it's
good.
I was gonna say, but the eulogy, as insane as it is, points to this truth that it matters how you live. It matters how you live, and look at how this person is remembered. I mean, and the guy, whoever wrote it, wants you to know that he's going to be donkey's ashes or donkey's shavings at the end of the day.
Yeah, that was important to him because he felt that there was something to memorialize in a negative sense. Because even if you think life ends, which, you know, from a naturalist, materialist worldview you would, when we get to that moment, most people lose that sense of consistency because they realize the absurdity of, I don't want to live this way. I don't want to die this way. I think that's critical. I'll read you guys, and this is the last thing I'll read. It's just funny because I thought it was from Jane. I hadn't thought of this in years. This is the eulogy I wrote. I actually thinking of Hawking, but I didn't really put his name to it because I didn't want to sound mean. But so I put her life, but I really wrote this for Hawking. But he said her life was a chance occurrence with no inherent value. A bunch of inferior cells got corrupted by disease, and nature selected her out of existence. She was a woman whose thoughts were nothing more than a biochemical reaction to sensory perceptions that have no intrinsic meaning beyond present culture, and now she's dead. Her physical form decaying in the dirt. No need to wish her peace because her life is simply over. A meaningless blip on the billions of years of meaningless evolution. I think that's at least honest.
Yeah.
Within that worldview, you know.
Yeah, people want to be brave and bold in their expression of that worldview, but every aspect of the way that they live fights against that particular view. They don't live that way generally in relationships with their children. They don't live that way generally in relationships with other loved ones. They don't live that way generally in relationship to their work. Generally, I mean, most people think that their work, especially somebody like Hawking, thinks that their work is meaningful. You know, why should Hawking's work have ultimate meaning and exist long after he's gone? I mean, why? I mean, these are questions that we ought to ask, you know, especially when we're asking, you know, about, you know, does life really make sense? I mean, he's dead now. You know, does his life really make sense? Well, those of us who think that there is someone who will remember the good and the bad that we've done for eternity and will reward people as well as punish people eternally for the good and the bad that they've done, we think that the life that we live matters because we're going to be held accountable, you know, for the way that we live. And insofar as we acknowledge that in the way that we, in our thinking, in the way that we live, then our lives become more and more meaningful as we go along. And insofar as we fail to acknowledge that, our lives become, I mean, I don't want to say worthless because I don't really believe that anybody's life is worthless, but the value that it could add becomes less and less valuable if you live your life as if it has no meaning.
Yeah. Jane, have you ever, like, when you're having conversations with folks, have you ever like asked one of your, you know, non-believing students or somebody who's questioning, like, why are we even having this argument? I mean, if there is no God, if it doesn't matter, why would you even care to argue against a Christian? They're just they're deluded or they're wrong. Who cares? Has that ever come up for you?
It does. You know, like when they start pointing their finger at the things that we believe that are backwards or regressive, like we're like, well, you're just wrong for that. And they don't believe any kind of absolutes. It's like, well, you can't really tell me I'm wrong for anything. And so, and then having conversations is like, what does this matter in the end? I mean, we do, because a lot of one of the number one questions people ask is like, is there meaning and purpose in life? And then when you're sitting in these circles with these kids, you probably have half of them who say there's no meaning, and then you have half of them saying there is. So there's usually the more spiritual ones who think, yeah, there is meaning and purpose to it, and we want to live really good lives. And then you have the ones that say things are meaningless. But then why are you even here having this conversation with us if in the end it doesn't matter? Because obviously it does matter, because you're actually kind of mad that somebody actually thinks there's meaning in life. So so it's
that's the sort of absurdity, right?
Yeah.
It's like you say on one hand there is no truth, so you find it necessary to argue about somebody else who does think that, but who cares? I mean,
it's a very interesting statement. Now think about what that person who says that there's no meaning, think about what they're really saying. They're saying that in this life there really isn't any meaning. They will also, I guarantee, they will also add to this. That way, that's the reason why I need to live my life to the fullest, right? That's why I need to. But when you actually ask them, are you really living your life to the fullest? The answer is no, and the reason why is they've wed themselves to a system that they don't believe in. So ultimately what they're saying is, I'm going to live my life, a life which I think is absurd, and I should live to the fullest under the constraints of other people, right? I mean, because if you're really going to go for it, that means that you should be a total hedonist, right? Because for you, life is either about pleasure or power. You should be a total hedonist or power seeker. And most people don't live that way. They can't live that way because it doesn't make any sense for them to live that way.
Yeah, even making sense of the issues like we talk about race and those sorts of issues. I don't think people realize. I mean, when I have conversations about those sort of things, if you're working from this completely, without God framework, whatever that people want to call that philosophically, whenever you have that framework and you say, well, this is, we want to oppose racism. Well, the question is why? Why does it matter? Well, because evolution tells us we do better in groups and helping each other survive. Okay, true. Okay, that's true. But what if I've got my group of people and I care about their survival, and your group of people's in the way of my group of people, so I should wipe you out. And that's so right. you start having all these conversations, and eventually it almost always comes down to, well, yeah, but I just think the preference is that we should all get along.
Well, why? Yeah, so why? But why? I mean,
but there is no reason. Except for selfishness.
I asking the question. I want to ask, what do you mean by good? I mean, you're good. Good for you is different from good for me. Why? I want to know why. And they can never get to the why other than, like you said, I just prefer it. Well, I just prefer to live opposite of you. I mean, at the very bottom, it's a matter of preferences. I mean, at the very bottom.
Yeah.
On their view.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, I forgot what the exact quote is, but I think it was a Ravi Zacharias thing, and it talks about preferences. It's kind of along the lines of like, oh, some people love their friends and care for their friends, and some people eat them. It's something like that. Something really crazy like that. Yeah. So it's like, it just shows you the how you logically follow this if you really live that way. It's like, well, some people love their friends and some are cannibalists.
Yeah. Yeah, I wrote a post years ago called "Reasonable People Eat Their Children," and it was when you had the Russians, whenever they were in the war, and there was these terrible winters and food shortages. After the war, this is after World War I, they had found these giant vats, like the old rain barrels and stuff, and these families had thrown their kids in there to pickle them so that they could have something to eat over long periods of time. So they'd actually literally pickled their children in these big vats so they could eat off of them. And for a worldview without God, it is. But for a worldview without God, if there is no absolute truth, if there's no inherent value to people, if there's no, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, I might feel okay, that's gross. But gross is a subjective reaction, even.
Yeah, it's just mine.
That's just my personal feeling about it.
Yeah.
But I can't say anything objectively that it was wrong or evil
Yeah.
if I don't have that framework. And that's where this absurdity of life comes in, because at one point there, I think because we're made in God's image, people want to value other lives. They want to say
Yeah.
that's wrong. They know it.
Right.
I mean, the scripture tells us that that's built into us. We know instinctively that's wrong. But we can't say why, and we can't say it's absolute, and we can't say that it applies to everybody, because our worldview is telling us, that's creating this conflict of absurdity. And I think that's where the rubber meets the road for a lot of this stuff.
I used
Yeah, and
to,
you can't tell people what to do because that's oppressive.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
used to sit in a class every year. I would get new students, and I would sit in my class, and I would pull in front of the students a table and a chair, and I would ask the students, "What is this?" And I would point to the table, and they would say a table, and then I'd point to the chair, and I'd say, "What is that?" And they'd say a chair, and I asked them the next question, "Why do you call it a table?" Because you could write on it. So then I would take a piece of paper, and then I'd go to the chair, and I would write on the chair. And then I said, "Well, why do you call this a chair?" Because you could sit on it. And I would sit on the table. And we would go back and forth about this for like 10 minutes, because the whole point that I was aiming at was to get them to understand that a thing is what it is on the basis of what created or who created it. And we would wrestle for a while on these questions, but these kids would get it, that a thing isn't what it is merely because of its function. It is what it is because of by virtue of the one who created it. They're what we are because of who God created us to be. So once we would get past this hurdle, then I would find a boy. I would pick this boy out in the beginning of class who had some nice sneakers, and I would say, "Can I see one of your sneakers?" And the kid would take off the sneakers, and I would take off my shoe, and it could never fit on my shoe, but I'd put it on my foot, and I said, "Can I see the other one?" And he'd give me his other shoes, and I would say, "I'm keeping these. These are mine." And the whole class would just lose its mind, screaming at me, "You can't keep this guy's sneaker." And I was like, and I just hold him tight and say, "I love them, they're mine." And he would fight me on this. And the whole first 2 weeks of class was trying to put the scaffolding in of objective truth in reality, because we naturally frame the world in that way. And we have to be taught out of it. We have to have some reason.
Yeah, we have to be
no longer
educated.
believe it.
We have to be
Yeah.
educated to accept the absurdity, and that to accept that our absurdity is somehow reasonable.
Yeah, or some strong desire, that causes me to override this strong, this already present understanding of objective reality. I have to have some strong desire to override that. For most young men, it's women. And it's so funny that we have this conversation with the young men. I have this conversation with a lot of young men, and it always has to do with their desire to date and whatever. And these are fertile conversations that we would.
It's the only reason young boys take showers. Women.
Because if there were none, they don't. They wouldn't. They absolutely wouldn't.
No.
You need to have grandsons and say, "Yo, Holmes, shower."
Yeah.
That's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
my
I
wife
mean,
has to tell me, "You stink. Take a shower." I'm like, "Oh, really? It's only been like a few days.
I had one like
I'm in lockdown, you know."
But what we're really getting at is that in order for life to really make sense and be meaningful, objective reality has to exist. And if objective reality doesn't exist, then life doesn't really make sense. But the one who anchors objective reality is God. Because without God, it's all up for grabs.
Okay, so let's transition with that away from this sort of, without God, and the non-believer, the atheist or agnostic, whoever that might be. But what about the person who believes in God and says, "Okay, I believe in the God of the Bible, I'm a Christian," yet still ends up experiencing this sense of absurdity? So is belief in God itself the answer to resolving that absurdity, or is it something deeper? What do you guys think about that? I mean, it's just, I acknowledge there's a God, therefore life now has all this deep meaning, or is it possible to believe in God and still live as if life is absurd? What's your experience with that?
we have to talk about what kind of God we're talking about. Are we talking about a God who is giving us a way to live, or is this just some like deistic God that just like put everything in motion and just left us? So I think we have to think about what kind of God we're talking about, and then also has it like talking about if God is giving us a way to live. I mean, how do you live your life? And I think, I mean, even Christians probably get a little confused by it. I mean, like I meet some who are really inconsistent with what the Bible has to say, and that's because a lot of people aren't reading their Bible. So, I mean, they probably, it's like, well, you know, I place my faith in God one time and I believe in God, but they don't necessarily know how to live the way God has called them to live. So it's like you're almost living like you don't know God. So those are some things to think about.
Well, yeah, that's a very good point. The first answer is, has God communicated with us? And then what has he communicated to us? And the Bible says that we all have a knowledge of God, even though those of us who suppress it. So the answer to the first question is, yeah, everybody has a knowledge of God. The scriptures tell us that. Everybody does. But some suppress that knowledge. And because they choose to live a life that is different than the one that God, really has designed for them. So once we conclude that God exists, the next question is, and I think this is a Schaefferian question: has God spoken? And if God has spoken, what has He said? And in what obligation to us, those of us who claim to know Him and love Him and believe in Him, what obligation do we have to try to understand that communication and then live out the dictates of His commands with respect to His communication to us? So the first question is, a person can claim that they are Christian and live totally opposite of that. We see it in politics all the time. And
especially now.
Now. Then you have people who, and this is what we talked about, I think, last week, and I think it was Romans 2:17, who don't even know that they know about God, but they live as if God exists. So maybe that wasn't last week, maybe that was a few weeks ago, but we had that conversation. So it's possible.
Yeah. I'm just actually typing in a little chat so people see that verse, Romans 2:17. If those want to follow along, look that up. One of the things I think is, I'll tie this to I think the way church evangelicalism, whatever you want to call it, just the church in general has treated God and our relationship with God. I think it's led to a lot of the absurdity, even for those who claim belief in Jesus Christ. I always used to tell different homiletic students, for preaching stuff. It's like, you get to these typical sermons, a lot of them are, sort of the 5 happy hops. How do you, whatever the theme is, better marriage, better parenting, better ways to live with your roommates in college, whatever. It's always sort of, here's the 5 happy hops to a better life. And if you do step 1, I'm this, and then this week do step 2. And then, it's sort of just this formulaic. It's really a form of Christian magic in that sense. We think if we follow the formulas and we do the steps, that somehow we'll get the outcome of a happy life, that's a fulfilled life, and there's all this sense of purpose and meaning, as if that sense of self-satisfaction gives us meaning. If there's no conflict, we have meaning. If there's no pain in my life, then I must have meaning. And so we redefine the essence of meaning, what the essence of even relationship with God is about, to the point where we get into a situation like we're facing right now in our world, and we see Christians really falling into this sense of life is meaningless, life is absurd,
right? Because
all along they assumed that that meaning was in my being satisfied.
Well,
God was. They've
been set up for this, and this is. I don't want to go on a rant, so I'm just going to calm down.
Go for it, Larry. Bring some energy. Bring the power.
Oh, no.
Preach it, brother. I'm waving a hanky. If I had a hanky, I'd be waving it.
I know. They've been set up for this by this horrible preaching. This horrible preaching has led people to this, let's call it an existential crisis. Things are going bad in my life, and God doesn't make sense for me. If God made sense, then we wouldn't have the plague. If God made sense, then nothing bad would ever happen in my life. This is the the preaching that says, your best life now sort of thing. People have been set up for this. And, and I've talked to more Christians in these last 4 or 5 months who have just been unmoored, untethered, uncertain about anything. And there have been occasions, that you can be tempted to go down that road because, you want this thing to change. But I just think that we've been set up for it, and here we are in the middle of a pandemic with crises all around us, and people are panicking. And most of those people are pastors who just don't know what their job is, what their role is, or what the responsibility of people are. And they've set people up with their bad preaching for years for this foolishness. And I mean, it just makes me angry the more I think about it. And I wish I was brave enough to just go on a rant on Facebook Live or something and just start calling out names. I just wish I was just calling out names.
Do it now, Leroy. Do it now. See, I'm egging him on, Jane. This is how.
I've had to hold back on people that I absolutely love, who are just foolishness. And
I can see Jane's very disappointed that you're not calling out people. I can tell. I can see it. She's like, I think she's sweating. She's so nervous that.
I've been tempted, but by the grace of God, but it's foolishness. And the penalty is, here we are in the middle of the plague, and instead of us being level-headed people who pursue deeper into our relationship with God, let me give you one example, and I'll be quiet.
I doubt that. Don't lie to people, Leroy.
Let me just give you one example. It wasn't until this doctor pointed out that there are old people who are dying in these retirement homes with no family, no friends, no, Catholics, no last rites, never seeing another loved one. They died. And Christians, we Christians, I'm going to throw myself in there, were afraid of COVID. I mean, not that they would have let us in the hospitals. Maybe they wouldn't have let us in the hospitals. But what if we would have really insisted of going on into these hospitals? What if we have really made the case that these are our people and they deserve to be prayed over? And what if we really fought for that, in that instance? And it shamed me. And I thought to myself, we let these people bully us into being quiet and fearful. We have. And, this life is not all there is. Yeah. It is not all there is. And we're going to stand before the Lord and give account for how we carried ourselves, putted ourselves in this season. So, I mean, and that's I think that's the result of bad Bible teaching, and more materialistic, moralistic, therapeutic deism. I need to be safe. I need to be comfortable. I need to be protected. So, boy, I'm just really frustrated by that.
What do you say, Jane?
Well, I mean, just as you're saying that, it's like, me and my friends would joke around, like, so many things that we used to do as Christians that have become illegal because of the lockdowns. And me and my friend would just joke around, it's like, well, if we get arrested, at least we'll be doing prison ministry. And so it's just like the things that were so normal to us, just to how we loved people, like just doing things for people. Now we can't see people anymore because we might give them the virus. And like now that we know what this virus is really like, it's not as bad as we thought it was. Because in the beginning, I was kind of scared. So I was like, I better hand sanitize, I better, just be careful. But then it's just like, now that we've been through this, like, what is it, August now? I mean, it isn't as bad as what we thought it was going to be. So it's like, almost like I told my friends about these. There's some situations where there's so many new laws because of COVID, and so it's like almost like you're forgetting people's human dignity. So I had a friend who was, like they won't let a certain amount of people in the store, so she had to wait outside. And so there was like a scary man outside who was like talking to her, and she knocked on the door of the store. It's like, hey, can I come in? There's like somebody out here. He's kind of scary. And they're like, well, we have to live by these rules, so you can't come in. But it's like literally this person's life is in danger, and because you need to follow these new COVID laws, like this person out here could actually get killed. Like people have lost their common sense,
and it would count as a COVID death.
Yeah, like people's human dignity, and because you're just trying to follow these stupid rules that in the end you're not really caring for the person who's actually in danger. So like it's just it's just mind blowing
Yeah.
to see like people think, okay, if I follow these rules, I care about people. But it's like there's actually a person who's in danger right here. But because you
Right.
can't, it doesn't go with the rules that they gave you. You can't actually save
Yeah.
a real person's life in that moment.
Mhm.
So me and my friends are just kind of mad about it. And it's like, okay, well, you know, if we go out there and we're bold, at least we know where we're going. We're going to jail and we're going to do prison ministry.
Yeah.
But you know what's really cool about that is, I mean, and I really mean this. What's really cool about that is at least you're wrestling with it with an idea, which is, you know, I have this deeper meaning to my life, this deeper reality that I need to be more faithful to, and even though things are absurd now, and they really are absurd. I mean, they really are absurd. Even though things are absurd now, I mean, this is forcing, at least it's forcing me to really question and think through, you know, what my response to the world ought to be and how I ought to live my life in the light of that. I think it's important. I mean, we can't let this thing stop us from being who we are. So, I mean, at first I was against the pastors who wanted to meet because, you know, I thought that this was just being, you know, we needed to obey government. And then when I realized that obeying government was just, you know, it was just arbitrary. The rules were just ridiculously arbitrary. I'm no longer about obey government. No, it's just arbitrary.
Well, I think
I
that
wanna
gets
go down
into
the
the I think that gets into, we'll tie it to this idea for the believer though, where God, you know, even for those who believe in God, life can be absurd. I think because the church's messages has been for so long pragmatism, that we're in a period where it's impossible to be pragmatic, or at least our pragmatism leads us to do things that seem so insane. Like all the stuff you've described, like, oh, I can't visit somebody in the hospital. I can't do this. I can't, you know, as if, you know, being an essential worker is giving them medicine, but not giving them food, you know, the spiritual nourishment in their life. You know, Jesus, when, you know, people were hungry, he said, hey, there's bread. Well, which kind of bread do you want? You know, this or me, the bread of life? Well, I can give you this kind of water, or I can give you a water that you'll never thirst again.
Right.
And so we're so concerned about, well, here's the medicine, but what about the healing balm of Gilead? You know, the balm of Christ that heals us.
I mean,
we somehow think that that's not practical. That's the challenge. Is young people have been conditioned to believe that the gospel is not doesn't make a real life difference. That's why we have to turn to politics to solve our social issues. That's why we have to turn to medicine, because the gospel is ineffective in actually practical ways. You know, it's pragmatically, it makes me feel better. There's things it can do to give me a happy life, but when life goes crazy, I need to turn to do other things because the gospel then loses. It's this absurdity. Is like the gospel is all about pragmatics, but now it's no longer practical, so I need something else, and it's just we get into this sense of absurdity.
I mean, they stopped. There were no chaplains on those floors, from what I understand. I mean, I don't know in every situation, but from what I understand, there were no chaplains that were going into those rooms when those people were dying or they were sick, and they were still coherent to pray with people and to pray for people, to let people know that they are not by themselves. And I'm not saying anything about the nurse, because there's probably nurses who were there who believe in the Lord and who were helping, but I guarantee you, many of those nurses were overwhelmed with what they were seeing and not really prepared for that. So, I mean, we should learn from this and never, ever, ever let it happen again. We should never let something like this happen again and let people push us into the closet and tell us that what we believe is not essential. Should never let it happen again, ever.
What about, let's transition for the last little bit of time we have here. Now we've talked about the non-believer, the atheist, agnostic, whatever you want to call them. You know, for those who just deny that there's a God and the absurdity that leads to, and even for those who believe in God, there's some challenges to whether that can still lead to absurdity if they don't have a grounding for that. But what about the believer who does have a biblical worldview, that is reading the scripture, and they're suffering just as much now, and they're hurting, and they're feeling like, well, where's God in the midst of this? I thought, you know, because I read my Bible, I thought because I have a worldview, I thought because I listened to good teachers that somehow this would make sense what's happening. So how do we resolve that as believers who are also suffering at this and feeling like what's the point? I thought that there was something, that my faith got me something more. How do you respond?
That's
or maybe you've had some conversations.
That's a good question. That person needs two things. They need to be around authentic Christians, right? People who are actually living out their beliefs and are spiritually mature. And they also need discipleship. That's what they need more than anything. They need the community of believers to strengthen them and to encourage them when they're discouraged. And they also need to understand they need to understand what God teaches about this season. And they may need a course in church history to see that they're not the only ones, who outside of the biblical times who experience similar things. I can think of Jeremiah in the bottom of that well, for example, who had been serving God as a prophet and thrown in the bottom of a well up to his waist in mud, angry, God, you deceived me, and I was deceived by you. I'm never going to preach again. But then he said, your word is like a fire shut up in my bones, and I want to preach it, or to speak it anyway. So they need encouragement.
Yeah. Jane, what do you think?
I think we need to teach people more of the life that's after this life, because that's where all our tears will be wiped away and all the pain and suffering is gone. And I mean, the Bible is so clear about the troubles that we're going to face in this world. And so to tell people the reality is we might not ever have a great life on earth. We are promised suffering, but the thing is, like, this life is so short in comparison to the eternity that awaits us. And so I think that's oftentimes what Christians forget about. Like, we're kind of just living in this world and we forget about there's actually another life after this, and that's the best life. So
yeah, I totally resonate. I think both of you hit two huge things. Leroy, I think the idea of the communal nature of our faith, that it's never to be isolated. I think the way we've structured church, that goes back to not just the way we've taught about church, but the way we've built church, in these sort of age segregated, interest segregated groups. It's sort of a place of convenience. It's a consumerist mentality towards it. Even I go to this church for this, and I go to that church for the worship, and I go there because they've got a great women's study, and I go there for the youth stuff. There's been a lot of consumer mentality, even for those of us who have a strong foundation, who have that worldview. Our practice of our faith, the praxis, the way we do church, ecclesiology, all those fancy words, it is sort of helped our sense of community wither on the vine. So I think you're right about that. And Jane, I think you bring up a good point. I interviewed Clay Jones, now it seems like months ago, it is months ago, about his book talking about eternity. And I think you're right. That sense of knowing that there's a life beyond this life. There is a life yet to come. There is a deep abiding peace and sense of meaning and purpose that comes from that when we know the truth of that. So I think you're right on. I think I'd add the third thing to what you guys said, though, is the spiritual reality of our faith, the Holy Spirit, the work that he does in our lives. I think I was just having a conversation with one of my Ratio Christi partners the other day, and we were talking about, I think what this world has led us to realize is that in the West and in the United States, because life has been so comfortable, we've forgotten that our battle is not against flesh and of blood, against powers and principalities and authorities that are in this unseen realm, that Satan is real, that there are angels and there are demons, and there is a God who has given us his Spirit to bring us comfort, to give us conviction of our sin, and to help us know what's right. And that spiritual reality to the battles we're facing, they're not just about a virus. They're not just about losing a job, but there's an attack of Satan on the church because he wants us to think that life without God is absurd. And so we need the community. We need that eternal perspective, but we also need the Holy Spirit speaking to us the comfort and truth and the knowledge of Jesus Christ. And until we have that again, and it's not just a ritual, it's not just a consumer thing, it's not just a faith that's in a book, it's not just a faith that's in an academic study, but it's actually a faith that is grounded in our very being by the presence of God, man, we're going to struggle like this. And so, life without God is absurd. Life with God can be, but it doesn't have to be, because there is a deep abiding meaning that can come to us. So that's kind of what I was thinking on that third point. Oh, good. We're getting some applause online. So I'm putting up little hand clappy, smiley faces. That was probably about what you were saying, Jane, though. But about time I get to see them. So anyway, that's my thought. What do you guys? Any kind of closing thoughts? Because I know we need to wrap up here real quickly and about that. So final thoughts that come to mind in helping people recognize in this topic what they're facing. You guys all have conversations the same as I have with many, many people. What's next for the church? How do we move forward without getting lost in absurdity?
Mm-hmm. Ooh, that's a big that's a big point. Well, I think Jesus said to one of the churches, "You need to remember your." I think the Church of Ephesus, you need to remember your first love. Mm-hmm. And I would suggest that we need to remember who our first love is, and go back and remember and do the first things again, and then watch how the Lord works through us from that point. I think that's the practical thing that we can do.
Mm-hmm. I think the thing that comes across in mind is Jesus enough? Like, if we had nothing else but Jesus, would he be enough for us? Like, there's just so much going on in this world, and are we going to Jesus? Are we asking him the questions, and are we listening to him? And I think most of the time, like, Jesus is just an afterthought, is something that you just add into your life instead of Jesus being supreme and being enough, and he fulfills you and gives you joy and gives you satisfaction. I think most people go to material things and temporal things instead of the eternal things. And so if you're a Christian out there, I'd just reflect on, is Jesus really enough?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think even to just add to that, is he enough, and do I have that deep relationship to know that he's enough? Because he really is. I think you're right. And if I'm thinking he's not, I'm missing something. It's funny. I've been having so many of these conversations on critical race theory and all this other kind of stuff and all these race issues. And I posted just the other day on Twitter and Facebook and some other things, just this, basically just saying, look, our problem isn't race. It's the church. It's not, our problem is that the church hasn't spoken up on race. The problem is the church has lost the sense of the power and the drive of the gospel, that it not only has power, but it is a power that forces us to go out and make a difference in our world.
Right.
But that difference doesn't always look like the way the world wants that to look, and it's
right.
There's many different ways. But the gospel is power. It's the only power that's going to give us not just the ability to overcome, the negative of racism bad, but to know positively that reconciliation is good. It's this power to know that, yes, it's bad that people die of COVID, but it's also bad if they die alone and in isolation and of suicide because all those lives are valuable. And so we have to have solutions that drive us as the church, not to wait for politicians to do stuff, but like you were saying, Leroy, to speak out and to stand for what we know is true, because the world needs the hope of Jesus Christ. And even Christians, sadly, need to know the hope of Jesus Christ. And I say sadly because, even I've struggled with thoughts of this is so depressing and it's so hard. Why am I getting up today? There's none of us that are immune from that. We need all these things constantly working. Shows like we're doing hopefully here to help people, and community and loved ones helping us. So we need to get out there and do that. So, all right, well, that's really the show for today. I think we're out of time, and I appreciate you guys coming on and carving out the time on Saturday. Jane, you're sweating through it. I appreciate that. And
It's hot.
she had to turn her you guys don't know, she had to turn her fan off just so it wasn't this like whoosh noise in the background. Poor Jane is suffering. So, but man, I hope everybody knows, tune in. I appreciate you guys watching. We got Facebook. We got some comments thrown up on Periscope the last few weeks. We're starting to build some audience there. YouTube, I know, is we're live, so we're starting to build those things up. Appreciate you guys watching and kind of and participating in some way in this, even through the archives. Watching, you see the link up above, morethancake.org/off the cuff. You guys can get an archive of all the shows and links to all where we're showing live. But even the non-live interactions where people are just commenting, I'm appreciative of that, and always trying to keep an eye on those things as well. So again, thanks everyone. I don't know what we'll see what our topic is for next week. We'll figure it out, and we'll be back next Saturday, 5:00, barring any kind of other crazy stuff. And we hope to see everybody there. All right, take care, everyone. God bless.